Thank you all for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of my brand new colleagues who is at the University of Arizona this year, Dr. Beth Tellman, who will speak to us about her really interesting and important research that she's been working on with teams in Central America on narco-trafficking, forest loss, and land control in the Central American frontier. Dr. Tellman is a human environment geographer whose research addresses the causes and consequences of global environmental change, focusing on access to water, flood risk, and land use change. She uses mixed methods to understand to socialize the pixel, as she calls it, to understand the social processes behind environmental change captured on satellite images. She's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment, and her fieldwork focuses on Mexico and Central America, where she studied informal urban settlements, vulnerability, and adaptation to water risk, and the role of narco-trafficking on forest loss. I've put some links in the chat where you can find more information about Dr. Tellman's work, including her public application of remote sensing data. And also for any students who are participating, the University of Arizona, the Center for Latin American Studies, we are offering a certificate in Central American Studies for U of A undergraduate students. And I have also put a link to that in the chat. And before I hand it over to Beth, I would also just like to acknowledge that the University of Arizona is located on the ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham and Yaqui peoples. So thank you all for participating. And Beth, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna talk about narco-trafficking and forests and what's going on with the changing situation of land control in Central America, on the Central American frontier. So I'm gonna summarize a growing and really exciting to me body of research on this topic that I've been doing with over a dozen colleagues from different universities. A couple of them actually I saw enter the room, Rohit Mukherjee, who's a postdoc with me here at Arizona, and Nick Maglioka, who's the principal investigator of our most recent grant that we have with the NASA Land Cover Land Change Program. So maybe in the Q&A, Rohit and Nick, if people ask questions about your work, feel free to jump in and join me. Okay, so thanks, Liz, for doing a land acknowledgement. I'm just going to add a little bit onto that. As a land system scientist, I feel like we need to dig in a little bit more into land acknowledgements and understand sort of the value of that land. And there was a recent article by High Country News that published a database actually of university land grabs, their value, and the tribes that they were stolen from. So this is the value of that land from the University of Arizona that was taken in 1910. That's a part of our endowment. And here's links if you want to download those files or check out your own university if you're not here at U of A, to check out your university land grab and its implications. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is how we study illicit activity and land change, and why that's important to do in Central America in relation to narco-trafficking, how much forest loss we think narco-trafficking might be causing and how we know. And beyond just forest loss, what's really at stake here is not just trees, it's people and their access to land and livelihood and well-being. So I want to dig a level deeper beyond just deforestation and talk about land control. And then I'm going to end with the ways that the US government policy is implicated in driving those changes and what I think we could and should be doing differently. So first, studying illicit activity and land use change. It's a really exciting to be a land system scientist because there are hundreds of satellites being launched every year. And I take advantage of that data to see how the Earth is changing. But if we really want to understand why environmental change happens, we also have to look at data on human activity. And one of the sources of data I'll talk about today is using news media data. It's actually one of the greatest sources and underutilized, I think, we have in understanding human environment systems and human behavior. So we'll dig into that a little bit deeper. There's big news media databases where you can track not just narco-trafficking, but many other types of events. So I encourage you to check out the GDELT project if you're interested in learning more about this. And my role as someone who studies why, where, and how land use changes, my goal really is to go from what's happening on one parcel of land. In this image, this is an image of deforestation taken in Central America. Why did this happen? And if we zoom out a little bit more, this is taken from a plane flying over the Caribbean side of Nicaragua, and you can see deforestation patches here. What's happening at a landscape scale when we zoom out a little bit? And even beyond that, what happens when we take a look at those patterns across the globe? So I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of go from really qualitative understandings that we get from understanding why land changes by talking to people on the ground, to then understanding what's happening at a larger scale. And one of the ways I think we haven't done a very good job of that as scientists is with illicit activity. It's easy to see why that may be hard to do, right? Because by definition, illicit transactions are hidden. There's not good data on them. People don't want to talk about it. And so it often becomes understudied, even though it shapes so much of how land is changing. And when I talk about illicit transactions related to land, what I mean is exchanges and deals that are either illegal or just not permitted by some formal or an informal rule. It might be corrupt or criminal. It may be illegitimate and not be explicitly illegal, but for someone, it is normatively illicit. And because of that, it's typically hidden, making it really tough to study. But we can often see the patterns of human behavior, including those of illicit activity, by using satellite data. So I talk about socializing pixel data. And what I mean by that in this image is understanding the social processes behind what we see in satellite data. This is an image of the fishbone pattern of deforestation in the Amazon. So you can kind of see these long lines coming out from these logging roads and then smaller secondary logging roads along them. People who have studied deforestation in the Amazon for a long time immediately see and know what this pattern means. So that's what I mean by socializing pixel data. What's the social process behind this pattern that we see? But sometimes it's tough to do that. We don't immediately know what are the spatial patterns that link to a social process. So instead, we can try and use some type of regression or correlation to link what's happening when we aggregate up all of these pixels of change onto, say, departments of Central America, the percent of forest loss in each one, and we can correlate that to some other indicator to understand why is this deforestation rate happening and how. And I call that process pixelizing social data. So 2 ways, again, that I think we can get at studying illicit activity: directly linking patterns that we see to mechanisms and social processes that are well understood on the ground, or vice versa, taking data that may be census data or some other type of official data that we can aggregate up to some administrative unit to explain variation that we see in pixels. So I'll show examples of doing this with narco-trafficking in this talk. But before I get deeper into the science, I want to give people a sense who aren't familiar with this in Central America of what's going on. So cocaine that is routed northwards to the United States before and around 2003 often went through Mexico and the Caribbean. That was the typical route of the first point of landing when it left South America, but that changed. In about 2006, changes in the US war on drugs policy, putting pressure on Mexico to prevent narco traffickers from landing there, caused new patterns of narco trafficking. And that was to route almost all of the primary cocaine through Central America, the vast majority of it through Honduras, and also part of it through Guatemala. And that caused massive changes in Central American economies. This is a new paper from Zoe Pearson at the University of Wyoming, who actually tried to estimate how much money, how much value was cocaine accruing just by virtue of passing through Central America. And again, it is not grown in Central America. Central America is just the transit zone. But because cocaine is so massively valuable with every mile that it moves northward, it leaves a lot of opportunity for generating rents, developing airstrips, moving cocaine across borders, bribes to politicians. And every time it moves another country northward, that kilo of cocaine accrues in value. And what Zoe and her colleagues found was that in some years, and of course, I'll talk about this more, where cocaine is originally moving through in Central America changes over time. But again, the vast majority of it is through Honduras, these lines in yellow, and through Guatemala, kind of this section here in green. When cocaine moves through those countries, it leaves dollars, US cash dollars behind. And in some years, in the maximum year, can represent up to 10% of Guatemalan GDP, 8% of Honduran GDP. And to give you a sense of what that means and how much that is, that's like way more than their governments are spending on healthcare or education, coming close to the entire revenue the government generates in taxes, and also starting to approximate the entire value of the agricultural, forestry, and fisheries section of the economy. So cocaine is a major, major economic driver of change. And all of that money gets captured at all different levels, but is typically accrued by people in power. This has been very clear and obvious recently in Honduras because their president, their ex-president, was recently arrested for his role in narco-trafficking as the president of that country. And the new president in Honduras ran in part on a platform to undo the narco state that Juan Orlando Hernandez had built up. Will the US support her efforts? Tough to say, because her husband was ousted in a US supported military coup in 2009. So hopefully she'll get some support from the US because I think this is one of the best chances the country might have really to stand up to the power of narco trafficking, but it's going to be tough. So all of that money and the power that cocaine dollars have had at the state level has a signature on the landscape. This is a map of deforestation in Central America. The colors you see here in red is forest lost over the past 20 years. Most of this deforestation happens in protected areas along the Mesoamerican biological corridor. And again, this is the same region where 86% of all cocaine that comes to the United States moves through, generating $6 billion annually in profits. Much of that money, and sometimes more of that money, being primarily accrued in Guatemala and Honduras. So transformative amounts of cash. And what we're finding is with that cocaine trafficking and that economic influence, 30 to 60% of forest loss is occurring in protected areas, the places that are supposed to be the most protected from deforestation. This is another map of the Mesoamerican biological corridor. So kind of these areas in green are protected areas where we're seeing some of the highest deforestation rates, not just in the region, but actually in the world, especially in Nicaragua and Honduras have some of the highest deforestation rates in the world. And why is that happening? Well, as I talked about, there's this explosion of value of cocaine dollars being trafficked through this region that really takes off right at the change in the policy on the war against drugs around 2007 and 2008. And what drug cartels are doing is first clearing forest for agribusiness, cattle, and cattle ranching is one of the easiest ways to launder money. But second, and maybe even more importantly, it's for territorial control. So when there's unclear laws or enforcement of laws about who owns what land, cartels will clear land to claim that they own that supply chain corridor and to scare off other cartels, and also just simply to move cocaine through the area. So they deforest regions to build airstrips and roads, and then they often want to buy up land and clear land along that route to make sure cocaine has a secure pass northward. So we have not interviewed narco traffickers, but we have a lot of evidence from other actors that people on our ethnography team have interviewed, and I can go more into this in detail if you're interested in these mechanisms. Okay, so why does narco trafficking cause forest loss? So we talked about these two mechanisms here: money laundering and territorial control. So what's happening in this region? So first, there's cocaine is illegal, so it's incredibly valuable, and it's interdicted. So the supply chain is constantly being interrupted, bombed, and because of that, cartels constantly have to change their routes. And they're changing their routes and moving them into continuously more and more remote areas of Central American forests. And Central American forests are not devoid of people. They are full of people. And so a lot of times narco traffickers will dispossess indigenous people of their land. They'll invest in industries in that region. They will pay off mayors and corrupt elites. And that has a tendency to erode governance in that area. And all of this money laundering and territorial control has real implications for what happens on the landscape, and specifically for converting forests, as I've just described. So we're talking about airstrips, land routes and plaza constructions to move cocaine, acquiring land, sometimes just for speculation to make money, sometimes to launder it. So that's a kind of a summary of these mechanisms on the landscape. What do these landscape patterns actually look like when we're talking about narco traffickers clearing forests for land control versus smallholder agriculture? On the left, this is what we call the anomalous deforestation pattern that you see here in red. Narco traffickers tend to clear, or this is our hypothesis, larger areas of forest very quickly because they have the money to do so. And it's mechanized. So we're talking about chainsaws and heavy equipment, whereas subsistence agriculture isn't using that kind of equipment. And so we hypothesized it would have this sort of, slower pattern that increases over time. So these are very different patterns of deforestation in the same region, in the Rio Platano bioreserve in Honduras. And what we did was we statistically separated these big, large patterns, what we call anomalous deforestation. And then we got data on cocaine trafficking. So this is official data from US Army Southcom. This is kilograms of cocaine seized, lost, and delivered per year. And there's some data for some places in Central America. So we could correlate where is cocaine moving and how much of it is moving with these anomalous deforestation patterns that we saw. And what we found was that there was very high correlation, especially in Guatemala and Honduras, with this rapid deforestation that we see in hotspots here on this map on the right, and the places of some of the highest amounts of cocaine trafficking that you see in the map on the left. Okay, so there's a correlation. That's not causation. So we had to dig a little deeper. What we needed to do is get more data on narco trafficking because the official data simply wasn't enough. It barely even covered half of Central America. So we developed a database of news media articles that talked about narco trafficking events, and we geo-referenced them. And we wanted to know if that could be a better proxy of a higher sample size for narco trafficking events. And if we could get the media data to work, then maybe we could build causal models to understand how much additional forest loss is narco trafficking causing, in addition to other factors we know cause forest loss, like fires or population growth or constructing roads or agricultural development, all of the other typical factors of forest loss. So what we did was we developed this media database. There's about 3,000 media events from 2001 to 2017. And now we can make a more complete map of where narco trafficking may or may not be happening in Central America, with these kind of areas in red are places where we saw, or where we recorded more narco trafficking events in the media. So we get more spatial temporal coverage by developing this data set. How good is this data? Well, when we graph the media, this is the blue line of media-based narco trafficking events in one region of Honduras with the official data, we found something pretty interesting, which was, yes, they correlated, but there was sort of a shift. The journalists were actually picking up on narco trafficking activity 1 to 2 years before it was actually appearing in government databases. This is called the spotlight effect, where you can imagine that for security forces, it takes a while for them to get a tip, to hear that illicit activity is going on, develop all the monitoring infrastructure to focus on that region to start collecting data. So we realized that the official data, and this is well documented in crime studies, kind of has this effect of focusing on one region intensely and then sort of dropping off. So we actually think in some ways the media data might be a more accurate representation of the dynamics of drug trafficking activity than even official government data. And unfortunately, we know that journalists have paid a very high toll for generating this type of data and writing these articles, many of them who have been murdered in Mexico and Central America for collecting this information and publishing these articles. So once we could establish that, yes, we think media data is a pretty good proxy for when narco trafficking is happening, we could develop a causal model. So this is just a fixed effects panel regression to test for variation in forest loss over time and space, adding in all of the potential causes of forest loss, narco trafficking, and all of the things we know typically cause forest loss in land change science, and adding a fixed effect for every department and every year. So making sure that we were kind of taking out these effects for what's happening only locally in that region, or a trend that might be happening across the entire region for a given year. And then that's the error term. So that's the basic model. And the goal here is to estimate what is the influence of narco trafficking when you account for everything else. And here's the conventional model without narco trafficking. This is the null model. We find that increased agriculture, pasture, and population growth explain some of the variation, about 5% of variation year to year in forest loss in Central America. But when we added in this media variable of narco trafficking events, we found that we could explain almost twice as much variation in forest loss. So this is a very strong indication, not that just narco trafficking tends to be correlated with drug corridors. This is an indication to us that it actually causes deforestation. And this is pretty clear evidence of that. Okay, so narco trafficking causes deforestation. We've established that by directly clearing forest areas. But what about all of the infrastructure that narco traffickers build? How much more, you can see my titles. How much more indirect deforestation occurs after the narco traffickers leave? We know that with interdiction, when nodes get interrupted, these places, the supply chain of cocaine moves around. But what happens to the forest the years after that? These inroads that narco traffickers build, this is a road that was built in 2020 in the Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve, is an inroad for more people to come in and illegally clear land, even if it has nothing to do with narco trafficking. So the legacy of the narco traffickers' impact on the landscape lasts far beyond it, because it tends to develop infrastructure and roads and create inroads into forest frontiers. And that's what our team is studying now. So this is our latest research funded by NASA that I'm working on with Rohit Mukherjee here at the University of Arizona. And what we're doing is identifying roads and airstrips in protected areas in Central America. And we're creating a time series of where all of this is happening so that we can start to quantify how much more deforestation do narco traffickers cause because of this infrastructure they've built. So what we're doing is using the satellite record. I won't go too much into the methods here, but we have a really rich high resolution record of commercial satellite data through Rapid Eye and the Planet satellite. The Planet satellite is 3 to 5 meters resolution. And we're looking at the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica, Rio Platano in Honduras, and the Mayo Biosphere Reserve. And what we're doing to generate this time series is students on our research team are labeling, drawing by hand on some images, buildings, roads, and airstrips. And we input that into a machine learning model to classify the rest of the satellite image. So this is the input image that we're getting from satellite. These are students hand drawing on maps. And then this is the computer predicting a model on where buildings and roads are. So with these types of models, we can build out the road network of all of these protected areas every year for the past 2 decades. This just gives other examples of our labels of roads and the prediction the model is making. So we're getting pretty good results on our ability to actually extract road networks with high resolution imagery. So this project is ongoing. So I can't say yet how much more deforestation is happening from roads and airstrips from narco traffickers, but maybe in the next year or so, we'll have that number. We're working towards that. But beyond just deforestation, either directly by narco traffickers clearing land or indirectly by the forest frontiers that they open up with their infrastructure, what's happening with who controls land? I want to define this. This might seem somewhat obvious, but what I mean by land control is the ability to exclude other people from accessing land. And that is quite different from property rights, which is just the right to exclude someone. Having the legal right or claims to land is quite different than actually having the power, the money, and the authority to exclude someone. And this is really important in Central America because what we're seeing is that a lot of the places where there's forest being cleared by narco traffickers is in protected areas and indigenous territories. And so even though the state or other groups have rights to that land, they're starting to lose control of that land. So that's what we wanted to start to document next. How is land control in Central America changing from indigenous or forest concessions and state lands to private lands of smallholders, large holders, or narco traffickers? This is absentee landowners with a lot of financial interest who may not live in that land. Often in our study are narco traffickers. Where and how is that changing? And so again, we can look at this map of deforestation over the past 20 years and where forest loss are remaining. And you can see that a lot of the remaining forests are in these areas that are protected or indigenous. So really important to ask the question of how is that control changing? And our hypothesis here is that as long as land control is maintained by the same actors, we don't see a lot of change, that landscapes will slowly evolve over time. But when control changes hands, with an actor with a lot of power comes in, we tend to see changes on that landscape. In Central America, we're seeing accelerated land change, a lot of deforestation. In other places, like in Colombia during the guerrilla war, we were actually seeing sort of this pause or this deceleration of land change and deforestation that changed back to a lot of deforestation after the peace accords were signed. So it can really go either way when control changes hands, but that's what we wanted to understand next. When is control changing hands, and can we see some of those indicators from satellites? How do we know if land is changing hands and control, especially if it's illegal or illicit and there's not a lot of formal data on it? Well, you have to cobble together a lot of secondary sources. So what we did was we digitized a map of cartel land holdings. There was an article in Insight Crime where someone had gone through the Guatemalan land registry and matched up names of known narco traffickers to land holdings. And through that data, we were able to digitize cartel land holdings. CSIG farm seizures. there was a brief commission of corruption in Guatemala that documented narco traffickers stealing and seizing peasant lands in Guatemala. So there's a database of that. So that covers some of it. The National Protected Area Commission in Guatemala has a crimes database of land seizures. So we got access to that information. Clandestine airstrips. You can see a lot of these by satellite, but we also got data from the US Army Southcom on airstrips that they had bombed with the Honduran military to interrupt narco trafficking. There are known canceled forest concessions in Guatemala that narco traffickers have affected, especially in the Petén region. The US government has a database, they call it of kingpins. So there's actually databases of seized assets that the US government seizes and details for some cartels, and I'll show some of that data in a minute, where the assets were and what kind of businesses they owned. Again, news media, we have a lot of very rich information of where cartels were operating and what type of land assets they owned. And then finally, and this is Leah Manak's work from Northern Arizona University with Eric Nielsen, they actually surveyed nearly 150 NGOs in Honduras to get some of their ideas about where and how land control was shifting. So a lot of data you have to put together to start to piece where these changes in control are happening. So that's one data set. And then of course we have the satellite records. So we can see where there is large capital increases in changes in land from satellite, as I've showed you before. So we started to put these two things together to try to start to grasp where land control was changing. Okay, so where do we see some of these changes? So this on the left is media data for where cartels control land in Honduras. And so the bigger the bubble, the more indicators and more articles we had about land activity of cartels. So you can see kind of some regional development of different groups, some that operate in the same area, but some kind of trends here. This on the right is the US Treasury kingpin data. So this on the top is Los Cachiros, and here it details their ranching, a zoo that they owned, an oil palm plantation, there's a mine, and so forth. On the other side, with Los Valles, there's a lot of investments in coffee, for example. And so we could map up some of those different places of narco land control. This is our map in Honduras of airstrips. And these airstrips in red are the ones that were identified by the Army as related to narco trafficking. And in blue, these are protected areas. So more than 70% of these clandestine airstrips, these illegal airstrips, are in protected areas, in these areas in blue, kind of in this Caribbean region of Honduras. And when do we see these airstrips being constructed? Right around 2010, increasing a lot in sort of the 2010s and the 2015, right after there's this increase in narco trafficking and known cocaine seizures in Honduras. And we see it correlate with an uptick in media events, and of course, this other uptick that we see with deforestation. So this is sort of part of the story that we can put together of showing sort of this change in control and territorial control through airstrips and protected areas no longer really working and being protected, and land changing hands to the control of narco traffickers. So that's part of the story in Honduras. The paper kind of details what's happening in every department, but I just want to draw out a couple of main findings here. One is that we see this really rapid change in deforestation, this sort of sustained loss of control in nearly this pattern of half of all of the deforestation happening in Guatemala. 100,000 hectares of this type of, we suspect, change in control is happening in indigenous territories, 100,000 in state lands and protected areas. And we also note that 71% of protected areas have at least one narco-trafficking known event happening within 15 kilometers of its boundary. So a lot of changes in control happening in protected areas, specifically and concentrated on the Caribbean side of Honduras. What do we see in Guatemala? So the data that we put together in Guatemala, these kind of little blocks in gray, this is zooming in on the Petén region. These are known cartel land holdings that were registered in the Guatemalan cadastre. So all of these areas are owned by cartels. There also was 80,000 hectares seized from cartels. This is in part Caso Genesis, which is one of the well-documented cases in the Guatemalan Corruption Commission. And this is in darker shades of red, where there's larger numbers of hectares that the Mendoza cartel had seized from peasants. So we see kind of this same region where cartels own land and are also seizing it from others. And again, time series of reported airstrips in the Petén, land seizure accusations. These tend to happen more kind of around 2005, 2010, around when we see this uptick in narco-trafficking events in the media, and also sort of this earlier pulse of forest loss that we see happening in Guatemala. And that really all corroborates sort of these shifts that we see of cocaine really moving through Guatemala in the mid 2000s to 2010, and then sort of shifting south to mostly moving through Honduras. And again, seeing both deforestation and shifts in land control with that movement of cocaine. Other things that we know in Guatemala, again, over 100,000 hectares of loss in forest loss in protected areas in state lands, nearly 1,000 documented land seizures in protected areas. And it's hard to estimate how much of all this loss you can directly attribute to cartels, but because we have this cartel land holdings database and the Caso Genesis CSIG data, we know we can attribute at least 95,000 hectares of this forest loss to land that cartels either legally owned or were attempting to own or seizing from others illegally. One thing I want to point out that's really important to remember in Guatemala is where we see a lot of narco trafficking, deforestation, and cattle ranching is in protected areas. So these colors of yellow and purple and blue of deforestation mostly is happening on these dark green protected areas, and notably not in these areas in black of community forest concessions. And that's really important to remember, because I think it shows us that the most vulnerable lands to narco trafficking and deforestation are lands owned by the state in protected areas, and not as much land that's been managed much more successfully by community forest concessions. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in the conclusions, but the importance of really supporting communities and managing land in the face of these challenges, and really the relative success that they've had compared to the state in protecting forest. Okay, so conclusions of this section is that the efforts to improve land tenure and rights in Central America is at risk, because changes in land control will always trump property ownership. And many of those changes are happening because of narco trafficking. So our normal policies around drug policy and conservation is not working to protect forests or the people who live in them. And if there isn't aggressive action taken against this, then we're going to see further concentration of land and increasing rural inequality in Central America as land shifts from smallholders, indigenous territories, and community concessions towards large actors that have very little incentive to invest in the long-term well-being of people and ecosystems in this region. So what can we do about this really challenging situation, and how do we address it? One of the most important things that we need to do here in the United States is revisit the war on drugs and interdiction policy, which has failed, first, to actually end the movement of cocaine coming northward. And second, it's actually made cartels stronger and more adaptive by pushing them into more and more remote forests and causing all of this destruction in rural landscapes. I don't have the time to get into all of the details, but I do think Nick Maglica is in the room, who built the model that really shows how this works. But essentially, as this is kind of cocaine moving north, as it gets interrupted and interdicted, it tends to move into more and more remote areas, and it tends to move south as narco traffickers continue to adapt their routes in response to militarization. And what we found using this mathematical model that Nick developed was that it pretty well kind of correlated with the actual movement of cocaine through this region. And if you look at the total amount of cocaine removed in about the last 10 years through military interdiction, we see another failure of the policy of the war on drugs, is that it doesn't work. What cartels have done in response to the relatively small amount of success that militarization has had removing in cocaine is send more cocaine northward. So it's really been completely counterproductive to continue to use violence and interdiction in the war on drugs. It's not disrupting the cocaine supply chain really at all. It's making cartels move into more remote areas and causing more problems for rural development in Central America. So what do we do about this situation? First, more support is needed for Central American, in addition to the US changing its policy, support for Central American governments to investigate accusations of land seizure that indigenous and peasants are regularly filing with the state, and champion the communal land regimes that are working, and support the efforts at land management and sovereignty by people who live in those landscapes. ACOFOP, the Association of Community Forestry in the Petén, is one of the examples that we can look to that's really been quite effective in preventing and slowing down deforestation in Guatemala. Their extensions were just extended by the state, and we need to continue to finance and support those types of forest management efforts. It's a lot harder to infiltrate a well-managed community forest than it is to pay off a couple of guards in a protected area. And one of the other most important things is to really call out elite abuses of power in protected areas as part of anti-corruption efforts. And the new government in Honduras is actually doing just that. The new president is trying to close this highway that narco traffickers built through this protected area. Will she get support from other governments in the region and from the US to continue those efforts? We hope so, because that'd be incredibly important in addressing some of these issues. So I'm going to leave it there so we can have some questions, and just really want to thank the students here at the University of Arizona who supported this research, Rohit, my postdoc, and all of the other colleagues we've been working with over the past 6 to 8 years on trying to understand the links between land change and narco trafficking in Central America.
Wonderful, Beth. Thank you so much for presenting that research. And we have a good amount of time. We have 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Before I forget, I also want to thank our interpreter, Yvette Citizen. Thank you so much for your wonderful work. If anyone would like to ask their question in Spanish, that is completely fine. You can ask your question in Spanish, or you can write a question in Spanish or English in the chat. So I'll open the floor either to raised hands or comments that you might want to put in the chat.
Jake?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, am I good? Okay.
You're good. Go ahead.
So you mentioned early on that to prevent the kind of, or to, I guess, dismantle some of the narco state that's developed in Honduras, that the U.S. would need to directly support the government. And in your conclusion, you talk about providing support that is not militarization to these Central American governments. And I'm wondering what form that support would take from the federal government.
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of support that can be given that's not in the form of arms. And I think in Honduras specifically, the supporting financially indigenous territorial governance in Gracias a Dios and that region of the country, giving additional financial support in protected areas, management and governments, economic development, and really supporting people's well-being and livelihoods in those regions. I actually think that's the best defense against destruction from narco trafficking, and the most important thing that the U.S. can do. So a lot of support is needed. I think that can be mostly financial and for land control, and not necessarily military interdiction. And supporting kind of the sovereignty of the people who are living in those places and how they want to control and manage that land.
Anyone else like to make a comment or ask a question? I do have a couple questions, but my question, Beth, is this research is so interesting and so important and ties together so many things. The environmental consequences of the deforestation, the failure of the drug policy. I also wanted to add, for example, when I was looking at your maps, many of the places that you were pointing to, for example, in northern Guatemala, are places that in the last few years, we've been seeing more Guatemalans come across the border from those specific regions, right? Which is a little bit different than we had seen here in Arizona in previous years. For example, we mostly saw people from Western Guatemala, right, from the highlands, but we are definitely 2019, of course, not now because the Central Americans are not getting across, but 2019, 2018, we're seeing a lot more people from the Petén coming across the border. So I think the issue of this is all tied into displacement, of course. So my question there is, you have a lot of connections with sort of the US government databases. What kind of traction do you think this research has had so far or could have in terms of US policy? So what channels do you see as to how to present this research so that it can have the impact in changing US policy?
Oh, well, Nick, feel free to jump in if you want to, because we've had like some fits and starts, I think, with our research group. I mean, one of the things that I think has been challenging when I was doing this research under the Trump administration was that like they didn't really want to talk about this issue or recognize it. And it was hard to talk to kind of those working in US government at the US Fish and Wildlife and others who weren't really, even if they personally wanted to, didn't feel like they could work on or support this issue. The other roadblock, honestly, I think has been conservation organizations, that it's been really, really hard to get sort of conservation organizations to sort of see that drug policy affects conservation policy. And it's not just that they don't want to, it's dangerous to do so. So I think there's a lot of challenges in organizations working in the region and having a hard time confronting this issue. In terms of US policy, I mean, both sort of Nick and Kendra, scientists on our research team, have had conversations with US Army Southcom. I've done presentations to at least one of those groups, and I think it's going to take more than just, half a dozen papers and a couple of presentations to sort of convince military groups that militarization is not the answer to address this problem. I don't know, Nick, if you're here, if you want to add any other comments there.
I'd be happy to. Hi, Beth.
Hi.
Great talk. Yeah, so as Beth said, we've had some starts and stops, and one issue is we actually had a collaborator as part of the Joint Interagency Task Force South, which is the entity that is in charge of kind of drug interdiction in this area. And there's just a misalignment of values and missions. Like kind of drug interdiction is funded to be and incentivized to increase seizure volumes, and that's pretty much it. So they think very tactically. They don't think strategically long-term about what some of the other consequences of this might be and some of the more longer term, medium to longer term issues that it creates. And so until there's an alignment of those visions and missions, I think the research is going to fall on somewhat deaf ears.
Anna, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so I know that a lot of people in CONAP, like the Protected Areas Agency, thinks that they can somehow take back these lands. I don't know what situation they think that that's going to happen in, but what do you think the implications of your research are for the status or the strictness of these protected areas? Because the most strictly protected areas are the ones that are getting the most deforestation and the most narco traffickers. So what is the solution on the conservation side as far as what restrictions they have to kind of help reduce this problem? And thank you for your talk. It was great. And thanks for inviting me also.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to hear what you have to say researching this topic. I mean, what we've seen is that protected areas have not been able to successfully keep narco traffickers out. I think it's just too easy to bribe underpaid conservation officials, or, I mean, it's so massively, this from studying protected areas in Guatemala, even though they're legally protected, like massively underfunded. I mean, folks that we interviewed that were working in protected areas there get extremely low wages, like have to monitor super huge areas alone. And there's just no way that they would be able to control those lands. On the other hand, the community forest concessions that had sort of people in them and had livelihoods invested in protecting those areas seem to have more success. So I don't know. I mean, like thinking about how to finance and support conservation governance, and I don't know if the fortress area of protected areas and just increasing protection is necessarily going to do much unless you have sort of people in those lands, like with higher density, that have some investment in protecting them. So I don't have an easy answer as to how protected areas could do a better job, because I actually just kind of don't think the model will work against, I mean, just think about the quantity of money involved in narco trafficking, I mean, it's billions in Guatemala and Honduras. So we don't have billions invested in protected areas. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts? Actually, I'd love to hear from your research.
Well, I'm just thinking about how it's so difficult for any kind of compromise to be made with people who are living within the protected areas who aren't narco traffickers, because they're not legally allowed to be there. And so, I mean, there's just so many dimensions to this problem that it's hard to get to. I was just wondering, the conservationists will never want to downgrade the protected status of these areas. They'll never want to say, okay, these will become multi-use areas or multiple use areas instead of national parks. But this is clearly not working. So I just want more conversation in the conservation community around this is clearly helping narco traffickers, the strictly protected status of these areas, and there's not enough money to fund them. So we need to be pragmatic and what kinds of solutions that entails. I don't know, but I just love to talk about it with people who know about the situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's in that specific kind of situation of settlements in protected areas, I don't know. I think we have seen the multiple use areas and the forest concessions we've seen in the Platano are some of the places with the lowest deforestation. So maybe our best shot at protecting forests is accepting that people who live in them are going to do a better job than the national park system could. And that's just the reality. That's our best shot, I think. But hard to shift that mindset in conservation. because we've been working with this conservation forest model that the US kind of imported into Central America for a long time, and it's hard to undo.
Jake has a follow-up question. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, so this question is more about methods. I appreciate the discussion of the content, but in regard specifically to Planet, you know, I had used it a little bit a few years ago and found that there were some issues specifically about it being cost prohibitive and, you know, cloud cover really limiting some of the like geographic scale of available imagery. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to kind of the feasibility of using this for other deforestation and conservation related research projects, and maybe whether or not some of those like cloud cover and rural availability of imagery issues have been solved by Planet over the last few years.
Yeah, so in terms of access, anybody who's working on conservation in the tropics can get free access to Planet data. So there's actually no cost prohibitive issues there. So if you're working in the tropics, Planet has a program. I can try to drop a link, or if Rohit's on this call, you can drop a link to the NICFI program in the chat. You can get access. And anybody who's funded by NSF or NASA can get free access to Planet data. So that issue isn't a problem if you're working in the tropics. In terms of clouds, you have a few options to deal with that. Because Planet has imagery almost every day, you'll always find a cloud-free image. It's just going to take some searching and some work. The second option is Planet has aggregations by quarter. This is what Rohit is using in his research of bringing together images over many, many months and picking the one best quality cloud-free pixel in that mosaic. So those are kind of the two workarounds you have with Planet. Because of the availability of that, of data and the frequency, you can deal with the cloud issue.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. Do we have any other comments or questions? I am putting once again for students, for U of A students, a link in the chat to our program for the Central American Studies Certificate. So where if you're a student, undergraduate student, you can see information there about courses and scholarships and different opportunities. Okay, then I think we ended perfectly on time. Thank you so much, Beth. And also for those of you who are still here, there are some links in the chat that have just been posted to the Planet that Beth was just talking about. Also at the very top of the chat, more links for more information about Dr. Tellman's work, and her email is also in the chat. Oh, one more question here. We'll take this question. Beth, can you see the chat?
Yes, let's see. They wanted to ask my opinion on if the destruction of forests is caused by economic development of a country. If so, why? And if not, why? How to balance these two factors, forest destruction and economic development. Yeah, so I guess in terms of like deforestation and economic development, deforestation is not required for economic development. So kind of what Anna was talking about in terms of community forest concessions and multi-use areas in the Petén is it's actually the landscapes where people are getting some economic development through non-timber forest products, or in some cases selective logging, that they can build livelihoods in those regions. So you can actually have forest conservation together with economic development. They don't necessarily have to be totally opposed. So that's what I would say kind of in response to that question. But there are some cases, I would say, kind of depends what the forest is covering. So there was sort of this famous case in Ecuador of oil reserves in the Amazon, that the Ecuadorian government wanted payments basically to not deforest that area and uncover those oil reserves and try to come up with ways for other countries to invest in Ecuador to not emit that carbon. So sometimes what's necessary, if there is a lot of economic development opportunity to protect the forest, is to come up with some kind of financial transfer scheme to support the government to not not use those lands. And there's all kinds of potential ways to do that. I won't dive too deep into that because some of them are incredibly problematic, especially when you don't have clear and well-protected rights and control of Indigenous land and territory. Sometimes governments can take advantage of those financial programs to get money and actually prevent people from using their territorial claims to land. But a lot of opportunities, I think, to ensure both economic development and reduce effects on forest.
Thank you. Wonderful. So in response to a question in the chat, yes, this recording will be on the Latin American Studies, the YouTube channel, right, Andrea? Also, I put my email there. You can email me for the link directly. So thank you again. There's our link in the chat to the, thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you in general to Andrea Bennett for everything that she does to organize these charlas. And thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again. We will have many more activities around Central America and Latin American studies in general. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great weekend.